unlock the value of data while safeguarding rights. And in that context, we've been looking at what are the different models as countries become more AI ready that work for different use cases. And what we've been realizing is that it isn't necessarily about the technological architecture, but maybe about the motivations that countries are trying to solve for. So we've heard a lot about questions around sovereignty. So a lot of countries are thinking about how do we build data exchange systems that are amplifying sovereignty. We also have been looking at motivations such as delivery of government services, which obviously is a big use case for governments. We also look at questions like how do we make sure that there's transparency and accountability in the data exchange ecosystem, and models emanate from that. And I have an incredible panel to talk about some of these frictions. And I'm joined by Vijay from the Gates Foundation, Chennai from Masakane, Saranya from Razorpay, and Rahul from Trilegal. These are some of the minds who are going to be have written and are doing a lot of the incredible work around how do we build data exchanges. And I just wanted to start with a quick question to the panel, and we'll just go this way and then come right back. Do you think that there are these frictions between unlocking data for innovation on one end, but then also maybe safeguarding it for sovereignty? And how do we think about community value from that perspective as well? Start with Vijay.
Okay. Well, it's great to be here. You talked about tensions. I think there's data generation, there's data sharing, and then there's the safeguards. So they're kind of pulling in different directions, and it's all about incentives at the core. So there's got to be a viable sustainability model or a business model. So it's got to be value exchange. I think that's really at the heart of all of this. Is there a value being exchanged? If so, then you can get all of the stakeholders lined up and get data exchange going.
Thanks, Asta. I feel like if we give you the right answer, you will have $1 million. This is $1 million question. But to put it out there, yes, there are tensions. There are tensions around who actually has the data and who's considered the data steward, particularly looking at African languages. The assumption is there's a cultural and social nuance to it, and there are identity markers. So it's not everybody who can simply say, I am creating this language without actually following the appropriate route. And then there's also kind of like the point that Vijay is talking about, the value exchange. It also comes back to the value exchange for that particular, if you're thinking about community, which is that when looking at African languages, it cannot just focus on an individual. It has to be community driven, because that is the typology of most different cultures and exchanges and relationship building. It's based on community. But the question becomes whose value in that community, because we still do exist in a context of gendered inequality, rural inequity based on rural versus urban. So someone who sits in a university in an urban area might say, great, let's go collect this language from that rural community so that we can provide some technical solution without consulting that community. And they will think that they are the person who can make the decision because they hold the university qualification. And that rural community might actually then say, absolutely not, because you will begin to learn things about us that we have managed to exist and be under the radar without this knowledge being public. So then that is the question that needs to be added on into the value and understanding the tensions, particularly thinking about community, power, and already existing inequalities.
Thank you. Saranya?
No, I think in its current format, yes, tensions do exist. But my argument, it doesn't have to be that way. I think fundamentally, to your point as well, the friction comes about when there is a difference between the entities being able to extract value and the data contributors or the actual data creators themselves. And the current structures do not allow for those to be in the same hands of the same person. We look at, for a very pardon my very crude framing, but we look at, let's say, some version of big tech being the entities that extract value, and that the entities holding are in this constant, they find the tension as why they do not see the value being extracted as coming about to bringing value to themselves. They do not see the data extraction process as giving anything to them, and so it is the balance between sovereignty in terms of protectionism, keeping the data out of those hands, because there is no world where they are envisioning where that value process benefits them as well. Once, and I completely with you, that is a little utopian, and I'm sure that's why so many billion minds are in this room. But once we figure out a way to bring back value in the data extraction process to the entities contributing or creating those data sets, then at least the incentive process doesn't need to be an either or. It becomes more streamlined, and then we can get to the actual business of extracting the data, because ultimately that is a requirement. And in all of this conversation, sometimes that gets completely subsumed.
Before you jump in, I just wanted to throw something at you, because I know you have this paper on the New Deal for data, which also talks about, what are the different kinds of rights we're trying to safeguard against, and also how do we solve for some of that epistemic injustice that Chennai touched upon. And so are you proposing that this New Deal for data will take us closer to the utopia?
Short answer, yes. I wouldn't have spent 3 months writing the paper if I didn't think at least I'd have a chance. But I'm going to now, since when you said we've decided to disagree, you were looking at me. I'm clearly the disagreeable one. I'm going to start disagreeing, which is first with the fact that tension is a bad thing.
Okay.
I think it's actually great that there's tension.
I agree with that.
When there is tension, we are forced to think hard about the decisions we make. If there's no tension, we stop thinking, right? So I'm glad that there is a tension. And I would be more worried if the world starts to think there is no tension. And and I think quite frankly, a lot of us in today's world don't recognize that there is a tension, and that really is a problem with all the things that we've said so far. So first, I would like to say, embrace the friction. Friction is a good thing. It allows us, before we take a decision, to think hard about the balance that we're making. The point that I make in the paper is essentially that the governance frameworks that we have today, and I picked three, two really. I pick data protection, I pick copyright, and then I speak about data sovereignty. But that's sort of not an issue that we have. I think, as Chennai says, it's an issue that AI brings to the fore that we really have to think about. But if you think about data protection is a framework where we have enforced data scarcity. We believe that the way to protect personal information and then the way to protect privacy is for the people who collect it to have as little of it as possible, which is why you need consent before you collect. You are obliged to only collect for this narrow purpose. You are obliged to only collect as much data as is required to achieve the purpose, data minimization. You're required to delete the data after it has served the purpose, retention restrictions. This is the global framework for data protection. It's a framework that we have in our country. I suspect it's a framework we have around the world. This framework is at odds with what artificial intelligence needs, because AI needs as much information as possible for as long as possible. So there is a friction now with the governance frameworks. If you think about copyright is a lot, I mean, the paper is utterly provocative. It's like, it's shocking that I managed to get away with publishing the paper, because it's such a heretical paper. Essentially, as a lawyer, I'm going against everything that I've studied for, I'm not going to say how. Well, no, I've been writing about this for a while. I mean, I've been moving in this direction for a long time. But copyright is essentially, you have the word copy in copyright, and therefore you assume that you can't do any copying. That's not true. When we read a book, we sort of copy it in our head. And how different is that from the weights being adjusted in the large language model? And so I say the fundamental basis on which most people are going against copyright is that you cannot copy a book. Now, quite frankly, the large language model does not copy a book. It reads the book, it adjusts its weight, but nowhere in the large language model is a copy of the book stored. It just does not exist. It may be in the company. I told you it's heretical. The moment I say something, they will shut the mic down. But it may be in the company, but it does not exist in the model. And so there is a fundamental need for us to rethink the way we have governed data. Because if we don't rethink the way we've governed data, we're not going to be able to get the benefit of all that AI has to give us. Having said that, I'm not Rambo in the Wild West. I do understand that AI is dangerous. It could cause harm, and we've got to be utterly mindful about how we go down the path. And I'm not going to spoil the surprise, because you all have to download the paper and read it for yourself. There is a solution that I prescribe for all of these things, and perhaps we can discuss that in more detail.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. Yes, very, very provocative paper, because it is walking back a lot of the rights frameworks that we've all attached a lot of importance to over the last few years, because, you know, we need some shred of hope in all of this to negotiate. But Sanya, to you, you know, you also have a paper. Please also read that. And in your paper, you talk about a decentralized marketplace. And I think the question again is that, you know, if we are just allowing data to flow and people to train their models, then there will be some accumulation of capital that we have been talking about. So if everything is a marketplace, then people who have deeper pockets will just buy more things,
Yes.
right? So
Yes.
how does the proposal that you have like solve for some of that? Yeah.
The way that current marketplaces do.
Yeah.
So it's not an either or, and thank you for the chance to plug my paper. But here's the thing, right? To the earlier point, in the ongoing conversation, we have to first all come on the same page that there is a need to make sure that data is extracted. Let's take a step back. For a lot of the emerging economies, we are nowhere where we want to be in terms of our data for our own selves being adequately published, cleaned, transformed, even just core digitization. We are not in a place where, let's say, rural clinics, which have a wealth of understanding and data of rural communities, of local diseases, of local conditions for, let's say, waterborne diseases. That wealth of data needs to be digitized for ourselves to begin with. And which brings me to the very important reference of capital. All of this requires resources. It is a capital-intensive activity. And in our quest to make sure that this data doesn't go into the wrong hands, we are not getting this data out in our hands. This is very much cutting off our nose to spite our face. And that's not really where we want to be. If we want to, let's say, have healthcare solutions that work for us, we want to have AI healthcare solutions that work at scale to serve our own needs, it's not going to happen unless we have the capacity to have our data published to be consumed by whoever is the service provider. I am actually of a slightly differing view, and I think, subtly put, I'm at a point where I want to understand the value of data sovereignty and in what form. Data sovereignty is a term we use fairly widely across a variety of use cases. Depending, in certain cases, it's about establishing jurisdiction. In certain cases, it's about establishing ownership. In certain cases, it's about establishing our capacity to negotiate the ownership of the data, all of which have their own place. My only argument is, if we are establishing data sovereignty, we should have a good perspective of to what end and why. To answer your point, it is not an accumulation of resources. So the way the marketplace construct is put across in the paper is that in pricing or valuing the data set, there is no need to, let's say, have the same cost point of a data set for a big tech company that you would otherwise want to give for an academic institution. There is capacity to have varying terms, whether it's in pricing, whether it's in licensing terms. Having that elbow room occurs. However, this is with a keen understanding that this entire construct works only when we, as data contributors, start having the capacity and willingness to start extracting data and publishing it, and working across mechanisms where it is essential that the value extracted of the data is coming back to the contributing ecosystem or entities to keep that virtue cycle moving. And again, what is the point of it, and what are we trying to protect is something we need to know, but in the context of, but how do we get there ourselves?
Chennai, any thoughts on this question around, is the sovereignty versus value question? Are they, again, I agree the friction is good, but are there models that provide a through line where you can create sovereign infrastructures that also give value back to communities or the data providers? And again, I think the question is, again, like sovereignty is coded very much as the state acting on behalf of its people. So there's a paternalism to it as well. But is there an assertion of agency via sovereignty as well?
Yeah, so I will then give the example of Masakane, where we exercised sovereignty because the state was not interested. And in their defense, they were AI wasn't considered a bread and butter issue for a very long time. So Masakane is an example of a community that of community-driven, and in this instance, a community of researchers who went into spaces, international spaces, and they were trying to present work on African languages, and they were laughed out of rooms because it was, what do you mean Africans can actually do NLP and machine learning and they are not in a university in America or something like that. And so then COVID happened and people basically started making use of Slack, again, doing things by the bootstraps. There have been a number of papers that have been published because it was that knowledge of, for us to be considered valuable, we also need to be producing knowledge at certain levels. And so then those who had the capacity and skills or some sort of university tenure would bring along young authors as well. So you'll find that there are Masakane papers where there are like 20 people on a paper because that was the only way they could get the knowledge out together collectively. And I think that was an exercise of agency because no one was paying attention. And then for those who did pay attention, they were resourcing the community. And this is where I think tension becomes good, because for Masakane, we were being resourced by Google. And in the digital rights community, no one wants to talk about Google. So we're existing as this entity of young people who are interested in building up technology. Our governments are not giving us the resourcing, but the tech giant wolf is actually saying, what credits do you need? What cloud computing do you need? We've got this research center that we've opened, send your team here. And so then that is kind of like that indication of when we think about sovereignty, again, it's coming back to the value of like, I know what I need and you can provide it, but then we're also acknowledging the reality that like when we say community, it doesn't mean it's, you know, frictionless and everybody's happy in doing the work. But it is definitely about the understanding what the end goal is. And the end goal for Masakane was seeing African languages represented on a global platform, because they got tired of being laughed out of rooms. And so it became important for them to take back that power and then work with other people to ensure that those communities exist. So now we've got Deep Learning Indaba, we've got Masakane as a community, we've got Equalize AI, we've got all of these entities that have emerged from just a tenacity of young people wanting to see their language represented.
Fantastic. Yeah, just sorry. Can people in the thing please be quiet? The technical team, please. Thank you. Yes, please go ahead.
I wanted to jump in on what you said about what's the motivation to share data. So one question is, what if I, as a patient, for example, when it comes to healthcare data, I have the rights to my data, not the gatekeepers, because that's the core problem. Like in the US, is the EHR is not really, I'm not in charge. I don't have access to it across hospital systems. So that's one solution that will move us forward. And there's a lot of work happening here. Verifiable credential, there's a foundational technology. I'm interested in DPI, so naturally I think about solutions that already exist for doing that. The other one is in research, I've seen attributions are a big one, like publications, and then attributing source of data. There's also some, talking about $1 million ideas, there's some startups that are looking at blockchain-based solutions where for the data that was used to build a model, you attribute and you actually give them monetary value or some value.
I want to jump right to Montreal. No, but yes, the fundamental. You're absolutely right. The substrate of this assumes that there are rights over your own data for the data contributor. But the framework I like to use, not in the reference that we're making, but is like Copyright 101, right? Is that if you publish it, you claim ownership of it, that it is your data. In the very act of publishing is how you claim ownership of it. Now here's the point, right? Now, Yes, I did. The paper starts off from a point of privilege in saying that there is adequate legal frameworks that assures, the ownership of data. But even if you take non-personal data, right? Even if you don't go down the path, the non-personal data framework isn't very different. A farmer should have the capacity to. He knows his farm. He knows that data. So that is his contribution of non-personal data as well. However, all of this, we eventually need that structure to transform it from the theory to the practical. To say that I have the ownership, great. As an individual patient, I have my ownership. Yes, absolutely, portability of EHR is a fundamental issue. But in terms of this construct of being able to derive value in whatever way you use the word value, whether it is attribution, monetary value, the construct required for everybody from an individual to a farmer to a community to a small group of motivated individuals, being able to claim that ownership and being able to then say, here we are, we declare our ownership over this, we now want to start the process of deriving value from this. I think that's the kind of marketplace construct.
Rahul, I know you have your mic in your hand, so.
Yeah, I mean, so look, this whole thing about deriving value and attributing some monetary amount to it is fraught, because it's actually, I mean, the way AI systems work is it's not 1:1. So if I've contributed my data, I will get some value now, but two things happen, right? One is your data is not as valuable on its own as it is when combined with vast amounts of data. And then to try and figure out who gets what value apportionment is next to impossible, right? So why did a particular image generation model generate a particular image really well is not attributed to this training data set or that training data set. It is attributed to the engineering by which this whole thing was put together. So there's a fundamental challenge in valuing this. The second problem with this, and that's really the point of disagreement with our two papers, is that once the data is consumed by the model never needs the data again. Now, when that happens, what is the benefit to the communities that contribute to the data? And so the point of disagreement, so I completely agree with this idea of, we've got to have a market. I like the market solution because that's the best way to sort of attribute value. But I want to go one step further, which is to say that if you are a sovereign AI, if you're a large AI company, frontier AI company, you have trained with my data that has some value. I want you to commit to localizing the weights of the model that has been enriched by my data for the benefit of the community that has enriched it. See, what's the value to us of providing data to a large language model? It's such that the cultural and the contextual nuances that are currently missing from Western-centric AI models can become more relevant for African, Indian communities. And if that happens, they just need our data once, because once they've got our data, the model is already better. It already has the cultural context. They can keep that and then release a next version, and who knows what geopolitics is going to be like today. They may just say, I'm not going to serve India anymore because I don't like the way you disagree with me. Now, if that happens, I have contributed to making the model better. Africa has contributed to making the model better, and the people who have contributed are not going to be entitled to this. And so my claim, which is the one step further that I go, and what Saranya has done, is to claim that I want to use my leverage. India is a large country, got a lot of data that's going to enrich the large models. I want to use that leverage. Africa, each individual country may be small, but the entire African, maybe parts of Africa is powerful. And it has a lot of data that's not written, which is why it's missing from the models. We add that data, we will enrich their data. If that is the case, and if I have done that, I want you to commit to giving me the current sort of freeze frame of the model such that I can use it. The next iteration of the model, you want to use my data, you don't want to use my, I really can't say anything. But if you use my data to improve your model, I will. So in my paper says, visit, don't move. So essentially, the models come to the data doesn't go to the model, which means I will give you the chance to iterate one model, you make that model better, and once you make that model better, you leave those weights down. You don't take my data. You want to make your model even better by using my data again, come back to me again. But when you come back to me again, you keep that new iteration of the model in India or in Africa again. That's the model. I think we have a small window where the models need to be refined by this additional cultural data. I think if we don't use our collective ability to negotiate, we're not going to be able to achieve this. So that sort of is the data sovereignty answer, but for the copyright and the data protection, you still got to read the paper.
No, I mean, I agree with that part of the paper. So, because I also think that I think that this is the answer to that extraction and that accumulation of value without any ability to negotiate. And though at the same time, we've seen like in a lot of African countries, like this notion of data localization is seen as like the regressive thing to do. It is the anti-innovation thing to do. And therefore, it has always been said that if you're going to do localized parts of your ecosystem, then there's not going to be any way to come out of it. One is just on the ecosystem to you, Vijay. I know that like the Gates Foundation has been doing a lot of work on like building an ecosystem, and also, data is the third DPI. So how do we, we've seen the ID and payments ecosystems being built. Data seems to be already on the panel there are, so many different bits and bobs. How do you build an ecosystem about something that is so amorphous and full of disagreements?
It's a tough question. But I'll lay a framework. This is something, in my own experience, working in healthcare with cancer, Alzheimer's disease. And I think that model kind of expands to other areas too. One is creating repositories of data and making them discoverable, knowing that there's data sets out there that could help you build the model. So, let's talk about AI readiness. Is that the focus here? Then comes governance of the data, making sure you're fully in charge of who you share the data with. There's audit trails and so on. And then sometimes there's also clean rooms, kind of like what you said. Federated access is a good one, where the model moves to the data, but the data is always secure. And then one thing we've also done is build tools to make the data usable. Because a lot of times data is shared for the sake of sharing, like especially in research. You see that a lot. I've checked the box, but it really doesn't serve any other researchers. So making the data usable, which means harmonization, alignment with standards, ontologies in healthcare, and so on. And then attribution, we already talked about that. I think this would set you up for AI-ready data sets. And us as, Gates Foundation as a convener, we're creating ecosystems. Back to your point, I think what we did is creating benchmarks. So big tech, if they are consuming data sets that we built, like the Masakane data sets, training data sets for voice, we have our own benchmarks that serve the needs in Africa, and we ensure that they meet those benchmarks. And the standard ones are not sufficient. They don't address the local needs. The MMLU benchmarks are not good enough. They're more factual, and then the ones that we did, Sahara, and then there's a few others you mentioned. Those are more linguistic in nature, I suppose.
So, Janai, like at Masakane, how do you safeguard? Like, do you do the localization parts of it? Like, how do you safeguard? Do you have the model for who is able to use it and how?
Yeah, so I think this then speaks to our youngness in the ecosystem. It's open for everyone. So maybe let me balance it out, because again, I really love this idea of good tension. It's this existence of, we've built with values of Ubuntu. And that is an African value of practice, where it's basically my humanity is centered on your humanity as well. Where I end is where you begin. And that idea, of course, like I'm saying this, it feels so fluffy and warm, but how to actually get it done in reality is, again, that approach of getting everybody into the room and the attribution and the contributions. So we've, at least I think, at stage one, is that collective action of the researchers and our community, everybody on Slack, everybody creating it as open, and people working on it. So we haven't actually, and then most of our data sets are hosted on GitHub, so it's quite accessible, everybody has access to them. But then that's a question we actually are now confronting, and specifically looking at it from a perspective of licensing, because I realize it hasn't been mentioned here. So for us, and I really would love to hear your thoughts on this, Rahul, if a question of licensing in terms of like, we want for it to be open source, but open to what extent? And what aspect is open? So there have been 2 license frameworks that have been created called ESETU and Noodle. And they are talking about the value point, I think, that you're mentioning, where they're basically saying, we will create this data set and it'll be open, but it'll be open for Africans for at least 2 years first, and we innovate first. And then other people can then, if they want to use the data set, then they can pay for it. They're still trying to figure out how it all works. So I think the model moving to the data actually is a critical point in thinking about the licensing framework. And then what's actually met as a challenge is people's awareness of licensing issues. So we do have cases where people have, I think the thing is, oh, because I'm African and you're African, you're going to just give me your data for free. But we do have state entities who basically will sue us for actually making use of public information that is out there in the domain, because it is their government mandate to provide information in all recognized legal languages of that state. But when we try to make use of it, and when I say we, I mean the technical community, try to make use of that data, we do get flagged for actually going against copyright. But also the fact that we are not paying the state broadcaster, but the state broadcaster is getting all of that information from the people. So that is kind of like that realization in terms of dealing with the localization of data, and also really surfacing the friction that exists amongst the different stakeholders who may be from the same region, but in understanding what benefit I can get, there are still gatekeepers of that knowledge who are like, we've done this work to make sure that TV broadcasting has 11 of the languages, and you just now want to come and build an AI system on that. But we are arguing that there's value on both ways. So that is, I think, the approach that's taken of kind of like making it community-centric, and then also really trying to nuance the awareness around licensing and ownership of this data. In that context of that, it is community-centered, but then again, sometimes community is such a misused word, and that's the reality of the politics that we try to navigate.
Sarani, I know you also talk about tiering of access of various kinds. How do you decide the tiers?
That's actually the thing.
Okay.
One doesn't. The contributors do. And I think that's where, in the construct of, I think, what you're mentioning, Rahul, when you're talking about the localization of models, my one point, and again, if localization of the model is what a data contributor wants as the value attributed, so be it. If they want it to be monetary, so be it. Where I differ is in that quite often, the data contributor loses all negotiation power, and it becomes subject of the state. And that's part of how data sovereignty is interpreted, that all of the contribution goes towards the ability of the state to have this negotiation and say, you company who's accessing it does this. And then they say across multiple companies how you want to do it, and so on and so forth. The point of this is not just merely in having agency. The point of it is, how do we keep the data extraction cycle moving? Because in any other activity, if it's a one-time resource or a one-time funded activity, and then the state gets to then negotiate it, we've often seen how that's dead on arrival. It happens for that 1 year, the data extraction process happens, but then there is no way to keep it moving. There is no way to keep that digitization efforts going on, the maintenance of it and the ongoing process. It just doesn't happen until and unless you have value going back to that community or ecosystem or actor on an ongoing basis. Unless you have some framework in which that is possible, these are all one-time funded activities. And I don't think that's relevant to where we want to be. I can just talk about, let's say, in India, to even get to the base level of digitization or data contribution we want to be, there is historic data that we need to digitize. There are, I don't even go as far as millennia, but there is decades and decades of local data that needs to be digitized, and we have not even come to square one. For that process to happen, this is not to undermine philanthropic efforts, this is not to undermine foundations such as yourselves kickstarting that cycle. But again, how do we keep it moving? And that has to happen with some sort of value attribution. Now, if it happens by virtue of the state, that's great. But unless, completely to your point, why does a company come back? Why would a company come back to get the data only if the data value or the data quality is better than what they can scrape off the web? Unless and until we have some process, and that's a resource-intensive process, unless and until we're able to say that, don't scrape it off the web, take it from me. It's at least better in quality, it's better in accuracy, it's better in just the timeline in which it has been given. All of that is the fundamental bedrock for all of our conversation. When we are saying that there's capacity for anybody to negotiate data access, it only happens if your data that you're contributing is better than what's out there, or at least relevant. And for that, we need to get some value mechanism in place. I am arguing that let the contributors, however you may wish to define them, be the people who decide what is valuable enough to them to keep that cycle going.
I mean, look, I'm a lawyer. Ultimately, I'm just looking in a negotiation for leverage. And I don't think a single contributor of data has leverage. I don't think a community has leverage. I don't think a country which is smaller than India has leverage. So if essentially we want to negotiate a deal, we're going to need to make a critical mass of people in order to be able to bring the other side to the table. So I really like the marketplace model, but I'm concerned that we will not have enough leverage to do what it is. It's a mountain we have to climb. So I'm concerned that we will not be able to do it. I seriously think for Africa, countries in Africa need to band together in order to actually, because they will divide and conquer. I know that there are many data deals that are being done, even in Africa right now, where medical data is being extracted in exchange for something for 25 years, and that data is gone. The only way you can defeat that is to get together. And so my only point behind this is not that I disagree with you. I think we must go to the market, we must enter the market with a winning hand. And that's only going to happen if we have a large amount of data. The second point I will make, and this is to Chennai's point on licensing. I'm a lawyer, I've been an intellectual property lawyer for 30 years. And if there's one thing I know, laws are great and it makes lawyers a lot of money. But if someone infringes or violates your license, it's gone. You can sue them, you can hopefully get some money from there, but when I'm not sure, certain unnamed AI companies scan books by the millions, they will come to a $1.5 billion settlement because they have 300 billion in cash. But how's that helping? Because each one of those books gets something like $3,000. Is that? I mean, it is a huge, for an author who's never seen $3,000 book royalty. That's a reasonably good. But is that the compensation we want? Which is why my model is embed the legal principle into the design of the technical architecture. And so make sure that you don't have to rely on laws. You build clean rooms where you keep the data, and then you can only train your model when you come to that clean room and train the model on the data, and then you're gone, and then you cannot infringe my data rights because you don't have the data. And so we have a short window, India and Africa, to do this because these deals are being done right now. And many people are funding this. And then once they fund the collection of the data, the digitization of the data, they will own it. And so as countries, we need to come up with a philosophy. And I'm a huge believer in actually allowing people to do this, but we've got to do it smartly. We've got to realize that the long-term incentive of all of this is really to make better AI systems, but I would hate for us to do some kind of a new age digital colonization where data is taken to benefit the Western countries that have the capital and the GPUs to build this, and that benefit does not come back to the people who have contributed. That's the reason for the model.
No, I agree with that, and I appreciate the sort of call to collective action in this, whether it is countries, but then also communities, because you also talk about that in your paper, because I think it's very clear that we are not going to be able to negotiate in this fragmented perspective. We have 14 minutes on the clock, and happy to take some questions from the audience. But yeah, I will just pass you my mic. If you could also just one word introduction first.
Thank you very much, Bertrand Montubert from Global Partnership on AI, and we cooperated with Apti before. I just wanted to ask about the kind of business models you are mentioning, because I almost only heard the word marketplace. But what about commons, for instance? Because there is the economy of commons, and it can be different. I mean, some organization can have common interests and try to develop some products together, and maybe have some ways so that the way each organization has something back to it can be different than what happened on a marketplace. So did you investigate these kind of options?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for the question, because that's exactly the point. When we're talking about a marketplace, the architecture contemplates variable terms and variable access capacities of the marketplace. So starting from whether you want to give it for commercial terms, whether you want to give it for free. And the architecture contemplates that I can choose to give the exact same data set as a data contributor to a big tech at a certain cost and to a university for free. I can also have varying licensing terms of access. So the access capacities are also varied, whether it is, you can even have like an API download or data to model, multiple versions. But fundamentally, it contemplates this, that there is that capacity of choice, and in making it decentralized, it enables discoverability, and fundamentally tries to be is a tide that raises all boats. Because in all of this, we all know that none of these are net new contemplations, right? There are several data efforts already in place, but without that connective fabric is where it's not really reached the critical mass that we wanted to. So the idea is, with the marketplace construct, but as well as being decentralized, you're able to create access for all. You do not have siloed access, and then you have better opportunity for marketplace.
Just one challenge with the commons problem, right? So commons, if you think of the classic commons, is you've got a field for grazing where the whole village grazes their cows. It's common, it's for everyone's benefit. A commons works where everyone actually needs it, uses it, and continues to need it. AI is currently a bipolar world where there are a few companies that are going to generate the models because it's just fundamentally capital intensive, and we just do not have the capital for every farmer to be able to build a model for, I mean, just take model instead of cow. So there's a fundamentally extractive characteristic of the AI world that we're in now, which goes against the idea of commons. If they graze their AI model on our data field once, they never need to graze it again. And how do we deal with that in the context of commons? I agree with that, and I'm actually trying, see, because the theory now is that these foundational models are going to get to AGI. Once they get to AGI, we're never going to need a foundation model again, because AGI is going to be so brilliant that it will solve all the problems for us. We're already seeing signs of it now, because the agents are becoming so good that you really don't need to work anymore. Claude's calling it co-work. And so you don't need to work anymore. Now, when this becomes so good, you are going to go to the models that give you this sort of magical experience. Those are the people who you are going to do your data deals with. So I'm a huge believer in all the commons. Creative Commons, open source. I've been doing this. I did the world's first open source hardware license agreement in the year 2000. So I've been doing this for a very, very long time. But I am very concerned about the fundamentally extractive, and it's like one time they feed on this grass, they're never going to need the grass again kind of world that we're in. And we're just sleepwalking into this, all of us.
But what about, sorry, to the other point, these are all, we're talking about the general purpose situations. When we start getting into the purpose-specific implementations, whether it is, let's say, medicine and things like that, not to say that the large language models will be like useless in those situations, but will we not, isn't that the hope, that we will have multiple entities availing of these for specific purposes? That I would disagree with that, because already, why do you have country implementations of the largest language model in the world? For this purpose. why do we even have more than one? If that is the argument, because you're trying to say that there is additional value, there is an additional specific purpose, that when we're trying to create sovereign implementations, there is maybe it's a delta, maybe it's a small delta, but there is an additional use case that you're trying to serve, which is why there are country-wide implementations of this thing to begin with. Or else it is, here's the box and get going. This is a much longer conversation.
Yeah, I was going to say, does anyone else in the, yes, please go ahead. I'll give you something. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bharat from the Takshila Institution. So my question was to Rahul about what you said about data in exchange for models. So you already see that there's a large market concentration in the model layer, and wouldn't this mean further concentration? I mean, is there no way out of that then? And you don't see that happening, and you're just making the best with what that situation is.
I personally don't think, see, it's just the capital intensive nature of this industry. I do not think that we can let 1,000 flowers bloom as far as building foundation models are concerned. At best, we see many people build foundation models. See, India is building foundation models that are state of the art. If you look at what Sarvam is putting out, and you look GenAI, it's state of the art in a narrow vertical that the big AI companies are not so interested in. Indian language, simultaneous dubbing, OCR for old Indian languages. It's very good at that. Quite frankly, it's because Claude and Dario Amadeo and Sam Altman are not lifting their little finger to put some attention into this. Dario Amadeo said, let's build something which is good for coding because I don't want my engineers to actually write any lines of code anymore. And they've built the best command line interface for coding by AI, so much so that all of Claude is being written by them. They will completely destroy us if they really turn their attention to this. The economics of the current way in which AI is being built, which is large language models, the scaling laws, and what Dario Amadeo has just called the end of the exponential, fundamentally makes it impossible for more than 2, maybe 3. And if you look at what we've got right now, we've got Claude, we've got ChatGPT, and we've got Gemini. There's no one else in the ballpark. Everyone else is nice to have, but as someone who uses all 3 every day, there is no one who is close. Kimi 2.5 from China is sort of okay, but that's good if you want to do like poetry or something like that. So, I'm saying for the straight up across the board, there are only 3. That's the fundamental economics of the way this AI world is being built.
When you say models in exchange, you mean the way it's on the model?
No, when I say, so of these 3, they're going to want to essentially get better. And I think the last frontier is the data that's not written, that is not in the model, and that's our last bargaining chip. And if there is value of that, perhaps we can enter into a deal. But at some point in time, if the scaling laws persist in the same way that Moore's law has persisted long before we thought it would, they will get such a good general understanding of the world that they will probably start to understand the things that we, because of our ancient civilization, have in our ancient texts, because our forefathers got all of this, but they will understand it. They will get it. I mean, if they could beat the world's master at Go with moves that have never been played in Go, I can't see why they will not do that for traditional knowledge. I can't see why they will not do that for health. I can't see why they will not start to understand languages that they've never seen before. There must be some underlying semantic rules and logic to language. Who knows? They'll just find it. So I'm deeply bullish on where this is going because I feel that Claude Code is a superpower. So you want me to plug, but I've just vibe coded an app which will be on the App Store tomorrow. But I'm a lawyer. I've never written a line of code. I vibe coded an app which will probably be on the App Store tomorrow if it's not rejected
Very
tonight.
playable.
It's called Anagram Stack, and it's just to make like it's a Wordle for. Anyway, I'm just plugging it too much. But essentially, the point is that if a lawyer who has never written a line of code can now actually have an app on the App Store, I don't know. I mean, lawyers could perhaps do medical stuff, and ordinary people could do legal stuff. I don't know. We all will have superpowers, and if that happens, then all bets are off. So we have a small window to negotiate, and we just have to sort of use it.
Time for ooh. What did you do, Rahul? Time for one more question. I will go back to people who are not my colleagues at Apti. Huh? Yeah, about the app. Yeah, it's going to do. Yes, you, since you don't work at Apti.
Oh, hi. I'm Amok. I'm a policy researcher and like I've done most of my work with data systems with governments, but I'm looking to turn my attention into like how digital labor shape, like how AI is going to shape labor relations. And I think what we can summarize from this talk is that it is going to probably replace most work as we know it. So if the only bargaining chip we have is data, why don't we make it very like very monetarily expensive, or like make frameworks in a way that you can use that as a bargaining chip to get money to the people who have created those. So why don't we restrict the use of data heavily right now, make very strong laws against like using any sort of data by AI models before like you create a strong law about, let's say, a bargaining chip with collective data through data cooperations or fiduciaries. Why don't we push for like stronger protections against using any kind of data to begin with before like we get to AGI and sort of start having those
Just one
consequences?
comment. The point is just that as a negotiator, I know that when your price is too high, they will not come to the table. So you've got to get the sweet spot.
Would you wall up your data at Masakane?
Yeah, I was smiling as you were asking that question, and I'm like, then the reality is, oftentimes in these conversations, we talk about those with power and resourcing and what have you, but then there's also kind of like the inverse of limited innovation for the small people who just want to get access to that information. So, and I really like the point you raised on licensing, that's not where we should begin. It's about in the design. So what design principles are we putting forward in thinking about that data that's going to be created? Because I can immediately tell you that if we, well, that comes back to the example that I pointed out of like a national entity that is mandated to collect language resourcing, basically then will charge a smaller tech entrepreneur millions of rands for my equivalent, because they're like, oh no, we created it, but it's a national resource. And so, but then if that bigger, because it's rands, that bigger entity will call it $100,000. So they can afford to buy that. So then that way is the power dynamic that exists of like, do we put money to it, or do we figure out that collective action where we bring everybody to the table? Because I can definitely tell you, the technologists have just been doing this because we've been ignored for a while. But we definitely need the legal minds in the room. We definitely need the philanthropy funding, and it has to be south-to-south collaboration. I think that is where the sweet spot is, because as Masakane, there are certain things that we don't need to do because our colleagues from India have done it. We don't need to and then I think another key issue is also actually coming back to the point of labor. I think I'm quite curious when we say data is all we have. The Data Labeling Association, the people who actually do clean the data are mobilizing. So people are going back to old school trade unions because they've realized that the value that we are not having conversations about is in their physical labor. That cleaning of the data sets, certain tech companies are very clever thinking that if we go to Africa, no one's going to care. And they actually got dragged into courts. There are currently 3 court cases on the continent involving tech companies from Silicon Valley who were like, well, we're never going to go into court in Africa. They're in court right now. And it may be something that they're like, oh, we can pay because we've got 300 billion and it's just a small amount. But it is also a signaling to the people on the continent in the different countries that, hey, hang on, we've actually got some power here. And we have to find which big colleague state pushes first, and then the rest of us started. So it started with South Africa, they went to Kenya, and then Uganda. And Uganda has its own politics. But the fact that they're actually having these conversations with these entities in court is a strong signal to the rest of the continent. So I think that is the point of defining how do we actually still allow for innovation and designing processes that don't result in us then limiting our own innovation as the people who don't have the resourcing.
Our board says, oops, sorry. So before we are kicked out of the room, very quickly, we might forget, but this is still day one of the summit. It has felt like a very long day. But just from you, Vijay, like, where do you see like the data conversation showing up in the discourse? And like, if you had a line to add to the Leaders Summit basis this conversation, what would you do?
I would look at DPI and AI, how they come together and create a flywheel. It's very important.
Oh,
One sentence in the Leaders Summit.
I would say resource, not just money, but even the learnings of exchange and also something that is sustainable in the long run.
It just happened this way now. I think the one thing that I definitely do agree with Rahul on, which is that the window is closing. So I think just starting now, I think after all of this, if we can start ASAP, that'll be nice.
Rahul, last word, since you might be closest to the summit. Leadership,
Not at all. I'm very far away from it. But look, I mean, see, I may have sounded pessimistic, but I'm deeply optimistic about all of this. I would just say, look, embrace the superpower. It's AI gives you a superpower. Embrace it, and we will just sort of make beautiful magic with it.
Thank you so much to my wonderful panelists. This was lots of fun. And we'll be here, you know, talking about some of these issues. Read the papers, play the apps, you know. And thank you so much for being here.